I worked as a heating technician for 9 years. My wife left me for a billionaire's son. I lost my job 3 weeks later, and somehow I ended up as a gardener on a massive estate. And on my very first night there, I walked into a dark room and found myself face to face with the exact man who destroyed my marriage, holding a glass of whiskey and smiling at me like the whole thing was the funniest joke he'd ever heard. I want to be clear that this story isn't something I talk about often. I've told pieces of it to a couple of people close to me, but sitting down and going through the whole thing from beginning to end is something I've never really done. So bear with me if the timeline feels uneven. I'm telling it the way I remember it, not the way it would look if someone cleaned it up for a movie. A few years back, my life was genuinely unremarkable, and I mean that in the most neutral possible way. I wasn't unhappy. I had a routine. I had a daughter I loved more than anything. And I had a marriage that felt stable in the way old furniture feels stable, solid enough that you stop noticing it. I worked as a technician for a company that serviced heating and ventilation systems in office buildings across the city. Most of my days were spent in basements and utility rooms, reading pressure gauges and replacing filters, but the pay was consistent and the hours were predictable enough that I could be home most evenings. My wife Natalie and I had been together for almost a decade. We had a daughter, Sophie, who was just starting primary school, and we had a small apartment we were slowly paying off. Our plans were boring in the best possible way: finish the mortgage, save a little, maybe move somewhere with a yard eventually. I genuinely believed we were fine. Then things started to shift in a way I kept explaining away. Natalie started coming home later, became quieter at dinner, more distracted on weekends. One evening I finally asked her directly. I said, "Is something going on? You've been somewhere else for weeks." She looked at me for a moment and said, "I'm just tired, Ryan. Work is a lot right now." I accepted that because I wanted to accept it. But the distance didn't close. It widened. Eventually, through a conversation that came out of nowhere on a quiet evening while Sophie was already asleep, I learned she had met someone, the son of an extremely wealthy businessman, a man named Dylan who lived in a world so far removed from ours that the distance wasn't measurable in money alone. It was measurable in the kind of quiet confidence that comes from never having worried about anything in your entire life. At first, I told myself it wouldn't go anywhere. But a few weeks later, Natalie sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I'm leaving, Ryan. I've made my decision." Not that she was thinking about it. She had already decided and was informing me the way you inform someone that a package has arrived. I remember asking, "What about Sophie?" And she looked down at the table and said, "She'll be better off with you. I need to figure out my own life first." I didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there was one. The divorce moved faster than I expected. Legal fees ate through what little savings we had. The apartment had been registered in her name, and when everything was settled, I had almost nothing left. The one thing that stayed with me was Sophie, which was the only outcome I cared about, but it meant everything I did from that point forward had to account for a 7-year-old who needed stability from a man who currently had very little of it. About 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I was called into a small office by my manager, who looked genuinely uncomfortable, and told my position was being eliminated. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward and felt nothing for a long time. Then I drove home and helped Sophie with her homework and didn't mention it. The weeks that followed were the most quietly frightening of my life. Rent was due. Sophie's school had fees. Groceries were a calculation, not a choice. I applied for every technical position I could find and got very little back. That's how I found it. A posting for a live-in gardener position at a private estate outside the city. The salary was significantly higher than it had any reason to be, but the explanation was right there in the listing. The property owner was an elderly man with unpredictable behavior, and most people who took the position left within a few weeks. A small cottage on the grounds was included. I read the listing 3 times. I thought about Sophie's school fees. I called the number. When I arrived at the estate, I had to stop at the gate just to take it in. Several acres of gardens, hedgerows, old trees, a main house the size of a small hotel. A woman met me at the entrance, Clara, the owner's daughter. Polished, composed, the kind of person who makes you feel slightly underdressed regardless of what you're wearing. She walked me through the role without warmth. "The work itself is straightforward," she said. "Maintain the gardens, keep the grounds clean, show up when you're needed. What makes this position difficult is my father. He has episodes. He can become agitated without warning. Do not argue with him. Do not try to reason with him during those moments. And please do not ask questions that aren't relevant to your work. I asked whether there was anything specific I should know before meeting him. She looked at me with a practiced expression and said, "Just don't take anything he says personally." Edward was sitting in a large armchair in a room lined with bookshelves. The first thing he did when Clara introduced me was look past me at the window like I hadn't arrived at all. Then, without warning, he snapped something about the hedges near the east wall and pushed a small decorative box off the side table. Clara didn't flinch. I understood then why the salary was what it was. The first day passed with tension, but no disaster. That evening I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I walked to the main house to get a glass of water. The house was almost completely dark. I was nearly at the kitchen when I heard a man laughing somewhere down the corridor, a sound with a familiarity I couldn't place, like a song you half remember from somewhere you can't name. I pushed open the door at the end of the hall. A large sitting room, a bar along one wall, and standing beside it, holding a glass and looking entirely at home, was Dylan. Natalie's Dylan. The man whose arrival in my wife's life had quietly ended everything I had built over 10 years. He turned, recognized me instantly, and a slow, amused smile spread across his face. He tilted his glass slightly in my direction. "Well," he said, letting the words sit in the air. "I have to say, I did not see this one coming." I stood in the doorway and said nothing. He took a slow sip and added, almost gently, "Don't worry. I'm sure you'll do a fine job with the hedges." I turned around and walked back to the cottage. I lay on the bed in the dark processing the fact that this estate belonged to Dylan's wife's father, meaning I was living on his in-laws' property, employed by the same household connected to everything I had lost. In the morning, I seriously considered leaving. Then I thought about Sophie's school fees and decided to stay one more week. The morning after I found Dylan in that sitting room, I told myself staying was practical. The cottage was warm, Sophie's fees weren't going to pay themselves, and finding another position with housing included in the same week was close to impossible. But underneath the practicality was something quieter. Maybe I just wasn't ready to let one more thing be taken from me without at least standing still for a moment. So I stayed. Dylan visited the property regularly, sometimes with Clara, sometimes alone, always with the ease of someone who considered the place partly his already. He never missed an opportunity. Once, in front of two guests who had come for lunch, he gestured toward me and said almost warmly, "This is Ryan. He keeps the gardens looking respectable." The guest smiled politely. I kept my hands on the rake and said nothing. There were other moments like that, small and precisely aimed, and I absorbed each one because reacting, giving him a reason to have me removed, wasn't something I could afford. Not with Sophie starting a new school year and no backup plan anywhere. I focused on the work instead. The gardens were genuinely beautiful once I started paying attention. Old rose beds, a long gravel path lined with lavender, a kitchen garden near the south wall that had been somewhat neglected. I spent the first weeks learning which areas Edward cared about most, which paths he liked to walk in the mornings. That was how I started spending more time near him. He appeared in the garden most mornings around the same hour, moving slowly along the gravel path with a cane. I kept a respectful distance, but I noticed things. When Clara wasn't on the property, Edward was different, still had moments of agitation, still sometimes muttered to himself, but there was a calmness underneath that surfaced in the quieter hours. One morning he stopped near where I was working and said, out of nowhere, "The lavender needs cutting back further than you think. Don't be timid about it." I looked up and said, "I'll take care of it today." He nodded once and walked on. Something about his voice in that moment, steady, precise, nothing like the man who threw objects across rooms, stayed with me. After doctor visits, Edward was consistently worse. Not just agitated, but genuinely disoriented in a way that seemed beyond any baseline condition. The medical team came every week or so, a rotation of specialists Clara had arranged, and after each visit Edward would spend the rest of the day unfocused, frantic, exhausted by his own confusion. The staff treated these episodes as expected. I did too at first. Then one afternoon, everything shifted. The doctors had visited that morning, and by early evening Edward had become so agitated that two staff members had to help Clara manage him. A nurse gave him a sedative injection, and I watched through a partially open door as Edward went from frantic to still in under a minute. Clara stood with her arms crossed, and when it was over she said quietly to the nurse, Make sure he takes the full dose tomorrow morning." Something in her tone made me stop. A small wrongness, like a note played slightly off-key in a piece of music you know well. The real crack appeared several nights later. Coming in late from the greenhouse, cutting through the back corridor, I heard voices from the study. The door wasn't fully closed. I slowed down because Clara's voice had a register I hadn't heard before, certain in a way that made my stomach tighten. Dylan was with her. I heard her say, "The assessment next month needs to go the right way. The dosage has to stay where it is." Then, more clearly, "If they declare him competent, we lose everything we've been working toward. He needs to appear exactly as he has been." I stood still in the corridor. I heard Dylan say, "And the lawyers?" And Clara said, "Michael has already been told to slow everything down on the estate documents. By the time anyone looks closely, it'll be done." I walked back to the cottage in the dark and sat at the kitchen table without turning the light on. Edward wasn't simply declining. He was being helped along. The medication wasn't treating his condition. It was manufacturing one severe enough that doctors would conclude he was no longer capable of managing his own affairs. And once that was official, everything he had built over a lifetime would pass to Clara, with Dylan standing comfortably beside her. I thought about leaving again that night, but I kept thinking about Edward on the gravel path, stopping at the lavender, speaking in that clear, precise voice. Somewhere inside the chaos they were engineering was a man who knew, on some level, exactly what was being done to him. The next morning I arrived at the garden earlier than usual. When Edward came out, I waited until we were far enough from the house that no one could see us from the windows. Then I said carefully, "Mr. Edward, how are you feeling today?" He stopped and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not confusion, something much closer to awareness. He said quietly, "Some days are clearer than others." I looked at him and said, "Today seems like a clear day." He held my gaze for a long time. Then, just above a whisper, "They think I don't notice. But I notice everything." I nodded slowly and went back to work. But as I walked away, I understood we had just said something to each other that had nothing to do with the garden, and that whatever happened next depended on what both of us decided to do about it. The days after that morning moved differently. Edward and I didn't speak openly about what we both understood. We didn't need to. There was a rhythm instead. A look held a moment longer than necessary. A slight nod when we passed near the house. Small signals that said we were still paying attention. I kept my head down and started, quietly, to investigate. The medication came in small white tablets left each morning in a marked container on the kitchen counter, prepared by the nurse who visited several times a week. I wrote the names down on a scrap of paper and kept it in my jacket pocket. Then I called Peter, a doctor I had known for years through a mutual friend, not a specialist, just someone I trusted. I read him the names over the phone and described the pattern. The timing, the dosage changes after medical visits, the dramatic difference in Edward's behavior depending on whether he had taken the medication that morning. There was a pause on the line. Then Peter said, "Ryan, one of those is a sedative that should not be taken daily at that strength. Long term, at that dose, it would absolutely cause the kind of confusion and instability you're describing." I asked what an alternative would look like. He gave me 2 names and said, "But Ryan, what exactly are you planning to do with this?" I told him I wasn't sure yet. That was only partially true. Through Peter, I obtained the alternative medication. He made me promise twice that I understood what I was doing, and I began making the substitution each morning during a 15-minute window between when the nurse set out the container and when anyone came to verify it. The first few days I was so tense I could barely concentrate on anything else. But nothing happened. The nurse noted nothing unusual. Clara's routine didn't change. And Edward, slowly and then less slowly, began to come back. His morning walks got longer. He started asking questions about the rose beds, the east wall, things he had apparently cared about deeply before all of this began. One afternoon, he sat on the stone bench near the kitchen garden and said, almost conversationally, "I used to manage 30 people in one building and never raised my voice once. Funny what time does to a person." I sat nearby and said, "I think some things can be reversed." He looked at me steadily and said, "I'm counting on it." But Edward had to keep performing. If his condition suddenly improved, Clara would know something had changed. So he continued playing the role, and he was extraordinary at it. Every time Clara entered a room, the confusion returned, objects got knocked over, voices were raised. Dylan witnessed several of these episodes, and I watched his expression each time. Satisfied, almost bored, the look of someone watching a process running on schedule. Behind closed doors, it was entirely different. Edward worked carefully in the hours when the house was quiet, reviewing documents, reconnecting with a lawyer named Michael who had worked with him for many years, someone whose loyalty hadn't been redirected. And something else was happening that I only learned about gradually. Edward had been recording. Not recently. He had begun months earlier, before I arrived, when his suspicions first formed. Small devices placed in rooms where conversations happened, managed during one of his clearer periods and nearly forgotten as the medication took hold. With his mind returning, he pieced together what he had collected, and what he had collected was substantial. My role in all of it was honestly smaller than this account might suggest. I substituted medication. I gave Edward a reason to trust that someone in the house was on his side. I passed a few messages to his lawyer through channels that kept my name at a distance. The larger architecture, the legal preparation, the evidence, the coordination, that was Edward. Operating at a level of clarity that reminded me he had built something significant over a lifetime and hadn't done it by accident. The meeting was Clara's idea. She organized it herself, which in hindsight was the most useful thing she could have done. Inviting the specialists, legal representatives, and business advisors, everyone needed to formalize what she intended to present as an inevitable conclusion. The morning of the meeting, Edward passed me in the garden on his way inside. He didn't stop walking. He just said, quietly and without looking at me, "Stay close today." I found a position near the back of the entrance hall where I could see through the open doors into the main sitting room without being visible from inside. Clara opened with composed authority, outlining her father's condition, referencing the medical assessments, describing the impact on his ability to manage his affairs. The doctors nodded at appropriate moments. The lawyers had papers ready. Dylan sat to one side with his arms crossed, the posture of someone attending a formality. Then Clara turned to her father and said, in a tone that managed to sound both gentle and final, "I think everyone here understands that this is about making sure you're taken care of, Dad. That's all this is." Edward had been sitting quietly throughout. He looked, to anyone who hadn't watched him carefully for months, exactly as they expected, a little diminished, a little vague. Then he straightened in his chair. A small physical adjustment, but the room felt it. He placed both hands flat on the arms of the chair and looked at his daughter with an expression I think she had not seen on his face in a very long time. He said, "I appreciate your concern. I want to make sure everyone in this room has the full picture before any decisions are made." His lawyer opened a case and began distributing folders, transcripts, audio recordings, medical analysis from an independent specialist, a financial audit showing unusual patterns in account activity over the preceding year. The room changed. I watched it from the hallway, the shift from controlled proceeding to something much less controlled. Clara's composure held for about 40 seconds before the edges began to show. Dylan uncrossed his arms. One of the doctors leaned forward and started reading very carefully. Clara said, her voice still even but strained underneath, "This is not what this meeting was called for." Edward said simply, "No, it isn't." The police came in quietly, without drama, and the drama was somehow worse for their calmness. I watched Clara and Dylan being walked out of that room and felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction exactly, something more complicated. These were people who had treated me like furniture and constructed an entire plan around the slow destruction of an old man's mind. And watching them leave the room they had so carefully arranged was strange in a way I still find difficult to describe. Afterward, when the house had emptied, Edward found me in the garden. He walked out without his cane. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the rose beds before he spoke. He said, "Most people in your position would have taken the salary and looked the other way. I want you to know I understand that you didn't have to do what you did." I said, "I'm not sure I did very much." He looked at me and said, "You stayed. That was enough." We stood in the quiet of the garden for a while, and then I went back to work. In the months that followed, things shifted into something I could recognize as stable. I won't go into specifics. The specifics aren't the point. What I'll say is that one afternoon, a few months after all of it was over, I picked Sophie up from school on a Friday, and she mentioned, the way kids mention things, casually, without expectation, already half resigned to the answer, that there was a book she had wanted for a long time, something about a girl who travels through different worlds, but it was fine. She didn't really need it. We stopped at a bookshop on the way home. I bought her the whole series. For books, she held them against her chest the entire walk back to the car and didn't say much. But when I buckled her in, she looked at me and said, "Dad, are things okay now?" I looked at her in the rearview mirror and said, "Yeah, things are okay now." That was the moment I felt it. Not at the meeting, not when the police walked in, not even when Edward thanked me in the garden. It was in that car, in that bookshop parking lot, with 4 books about a girl who travels through different worlds sitting in my daughter's lap. That was when I understood that the chapter was actually closed. I don't work as a gardener anymore. I think about that period sometimes the way you think about something that happened to someone else, vivid and real, but slightly removed, like a film you watched a long time ago and still remember without being entirely sure why it stayed with you. I only wanted a job so I could take care of my daughter. That was the whole of it. And yet somehow I ended up at the center of something that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what one family was willing to do to each other for the sake of what they stood to inherit. I don't have a lesson to offer. I'm not sure there is one. But I do wonder sometimes what I would have done if Sophie hadn't been waiting, if the number in my account had been slightly higher that week, whether I would have heard that conversation in the corridor and just kept walking. I genuinely don't know. So I'll ask you instead, if you had been in that house, heard what I heard, seen what I was seeing, would you have stayed? Or would you have taken the salary, kept your head down, and told yourself it wasn't your problem?
It's crazy how life can throw you into such a mess, but then it all just fades away when you're finally back to the things that actually matter, like a quiet afternoon with your daughter. It's those small, peaceful moments that really show you've made it through the storm. If things are tough right now, just take a second to breathe. Don't be afraid to lean on someone you trust, because you don't have to carry it all by yourself.